Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this discussion on the evolution and future of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, part of the Policy Center for the New South webinar series, Shifting Security Dynamics, Assessing New Challenges and Opportunities in Today's World. In today's session, we will delve into the complexities of the Russia-Ukraine conflict as it enters its third year. And we will be examining the apparent impasse and its far-reaching global implications. Indeed, as developments in other parts of the world unfold and the conflict in Ukraine has seemingly reached a military stalemate, questions arise about the future trajectory of this crisis. The parties' reluctance to engage in discussions for a cessation of hostilities under current conditions amplifies concerns about the persistent global implications. At the heart of the matter, a growing divide between countries of the North and the South emerges, challenging the prioritization of the crisis on the international agenda and hindering collaborative efforts to address its secondary effects. In this webinar, we aim to dissect this intricate dynamics, shedding light on key developments in this conflict and their varied impacts and perceptions across different parts of the world. To do this, I am honored to be joined by three distinguished experts. Dr. Len Ishmael is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South and visiting professor at Mohammed VI Polytechnic University. She has a rich experience in international organizations and is the author of several publications and books on the Global South, geopolitics, Africa-EU relations, China, and the transatlantic relationship. One of her recent publications as editor and co-author, Aftermath of War in Europe, the West versus the Global South, tackles some of the key issues we will discuss today. I have also the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Serhat Shubukshoglu, who is a senior researcher at Trends Research and Advisory in Abu Dhabi, UAE, as well as an advisory board member in energy, geopolitics, and maritime security at Koç University Maritime Forum in Istanbul. With 20 years of experience across 4 continents, his expertise is in policy-oriented qualitative research and advisory focusing on the Middle East, and his current research focus is on Turkish foreign policy. I also have the honor of welcoming Dr. Gustavo de Carvalho, who is a senior researcher on Russia-Africa ties at the African Governance and Diplomacy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs. He has over 15 years of experience supporting policy development, capacity building, and research processes in Africa, focusing mainly on multilateralism and the relationship between African stakeholders and external partners. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for taking part in this discussion. I'll start with you, Dr. Len, for a question to set the scene for this discussion. 2 years after the outbreak of hostilities in Ukraine, much has been said about the conflict, how the conflict has accelerated the fragmentation of the world and led to the emergence of a North-South divide on issues as diverse as sanctions, the scope of reform of international system, and the mechanisms to address the secondary effects of the war on energy and food security. Do you see the content of these debates as an illustration of a changing global landscape, or simply as a way to leverage diplomatic support in a context of the conflict?
Thank you so very much, Sama. It's so very good to join you this afternoon. I think it's this afternoon, everybody's time. I could be a little bit wrong, but it's really nice to see my colleagues, Serhat, my colleague and friend, and Gustavo, whom I met for the first time at the Atlantic Dialogues, in December last year, to this rather topical question and discussion, and I'm looking forward to it. Now, my response to your question, which was in two parts, is that I agree with both the summation that the global landscape is changing and that global power is becoming much more diffuse. And also that middle powers have played an important role in orchestrating collective statecraft and pushing an agenda of the South. And just by a little bit of a segue, I think when we take a look at the G20 under the leadership of President Lula in Brazil for 2024, if you take a look at the agenda that has been negotiated and put in place not only by Brazil, but the members of the Troika, meaning India, Brazil, and South Africa, the next president of the G20 in 2025, you can see that it's very, very much that of a collective statecraft. It's an agenda very much that informs the goals and aspirations of the developing South, of the global South, or the new South that we will also speak about. And secondly, I think because of this fact, the role that the middle powers have played, including Turkey, of course, South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia, and so many of them, in orchestrating what I've been referring to as this collective form of statecraft, it's precisely because of this fact and the increasing agency of the middle powers and the wider choice which they present to the rest of the global South that we see the emergence of the new South, creating conditions and alliances best suited to their interest. So I start off by way of a little bit of a summary to say that I agree with both of the things that you said, but not in a polarizing way, not one or the other. I think that both of the statements that you made are in fact correct. And we need not forget that China itself, a superpower and a long-standing ally of the South, is a very, very important variable in this process of change that we are speaking about. But if I may, I'd like to step back a little bit and reflect in a way by putting these sort of ideas a little bit in context by saying that I think if we reflect on it quite soberly, tension has long been part of the relationship between North and South. I think it has been characteristic of the relationship between North and South. At the same time, we can also say that tension has been characteristic of relations between East and West for as long as we can remember. And if we cast our minds way back to perhaps more than 75 years ago to the early impulses of what we now call the non-aligned movement, or NAM, the world was divided already into so-called blocks. The first world of the capitalist states, the second world of the communist socialist states, and then the rest, the so-called third world, all those poorer countries which had been colonies and were striving for independence and equality in treatment and consistency in the application of the rules of the so-called Western-led liberal world order. Now we can fast forward to the current period, one which can be considered as characterized by a period of profound crises. The global economic crises of 2008, 2009 centered around implosion of the property market in the United States, followed, of course, by the market crash of 2015, and then in rather quick succession, a global health pandemic, COVID-19, followed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine in early 22, and in the fall of 2023, war in Gaza. The effects of all of these have been global in reach and scope. All countries, rich and poor alike, have been affected to varying degrees, but I think we can agree that countries of the South have been disproportionately affected. Their collective debt increased by over 35%. Their collective GDP contracted by a similar amount. The war in Ukraine added to their debt burden and food and energy insecurity, as we know. Many countries defaulted under the burden of their debt and suffered intense bouts of social and political unrest and instability. We have only to cast our minds back, was it 16, 18 months ago, to the scenes that we saw on the streets in Sri Lanka as that country neared the default of its sovereign debt and its government collapse. Each of these crises, I would say, has further deepened the divide between North and South. And the truth is, for countries of the South, the Ukraine war is simply not in their interest. They want it to end so that conditions of global security conducive to economic growth can resume. But the war grinds on in what seems to be a zero-sum game. At the same time, I think it's fair to say, great power competition between the United States and its allies on one hand, and China on the other, has added another layer to an already very dynamic situation, further disrupting all sorts of indicators of growth, none perhaps more profoundly as global trade. Policies of de-risking, decoupling, and destabilizing prospects for world trade based on liberal values of open markets, competition, and free trade. And the golden era of trade as an important tool of development, certainly for the global South, seems to be over. In many ways, my own sense is that the war in Ukraine was a tipping point. Countries of the South understand quite clearly that Western interest and proxy wars are not in their interest, that sanctions are a tool of coercion used inconsistently. Indeed, countries representing 85% of the world's populations have refused to enact sanctions on Russia. There's also a growing recognition that the human rights of all populations are not protected equally. Clearly, the war in Gaza has deepened this perception. In South Africa's application of the ICJ, for example, and I'm glad that Gustavo is on the panel, though of course this is not the focus of our conversation, but it's a little piece in the thread of the conversation, which I think is important. In South Africa's application, we get the sense that the West is accused of double standards and allowing ideological interest to trump the very values which it seeks to hold others to account. But let me conclude these introductory remarks by introducing yet another variable, which is the reality that global output, global economic might, is shifting from West to East. The US and the EU share of global output is declining, and we've written quite a lot about it, so I don't need to go into numbers at this point. And countries such as India, Brazil, Indonesia, Turkey, and many others are key players, or what we might call middle powers, and they are rapidly transforming economic power into political power as important actors on the global stage. Today, they are simply too important to be overlooked. And then, of course, there's China, a superpower in its own right and an ally of the South. So for the first time, and I conclude here, we see Western interest no longer de facto that of the rest of the world. And indeed, we get a sense that the era of Western complete dominion, power, and influence is on the decline to be replaced by something else, which is right now in the making. Over to you.
Thank you, Len, for this, for those insights. You mentioned something very important, which is the increase in agency of middle powers. I think Turkey is the case in point, and I want to turn to Serhat for the second question, which can be about Turkey. Turkey is a country that has managed to maintain strong relations with both Ukraine and Russia, despite the country being at the same time a NATO member that supports Ukraine militarily and a significant economic partner of Russia. Serhat, how do you explain Turkey's position and its success in dealing with both parties, especially given the fact that Ankara has so far been the only country to mediate talks over between Russia and Ukraine over a sustained period of time, and its important contribution to the now defunct Black Sea Grain Initiative?
Thank you, Osama, for this great question, and I thank also Len for her opening remarks. And I completely agree with her that power has diffused across the middle powers who claim more agency and strategic autonomy compared to the past in this increasingly multipolar world order. Let me start by saying that geography is, I think, a big determinant here, and it's both a blessing and a curse for Turkey. Why, one might ask? Because located at the crossroads of the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Western Asia. Turkey, at present day Turkey, but for centuries under, different names, Ottomans before that, the Romans, it's been a region of central attraction that oversaw vital sea lanes, lucrative markets, and in contemporary times, the, transit routes to rich energy deposits, which are highly significant, due to these diverging push and pull relationships to interregional and intra-regional relationships. I think in Ukraine-Russia war, the case of this war, Turkey has demonstrated three successes. One is maintaining relations with both sides. It has managed to avoid a complete breakdown in relations with either party, which allowed it to actually potentially act as a mediator. Second, that it hosted at the very early on, in the first few weeks and months of the conflict, talks between the parties for a period, demonstrating its willingness to facilitate peace. And third, it played a crucial role in brokering this deal, this Black Sea Grain Initiative, which we all know has unfortunately collapsed last year. But for a certain time, it allowed for the safe export of Ukrainian grain through the Black Sea, alleviating a global food crisis, or it actually allowed the world to gain some time to maybe recuperate from the aftershock of this conflict in the initial months. This on the economic and social side all played well. However, on the security front, Turkey acted as a multi-aligned middle power. As many other countries in the region that we see nowadays, take, for example, Saudi Arabia, UAE, South Africa, Egypt, new members of the BRICS Plus group. These are all multi-aligned middle powers, if I might call, that, in Turkey, especially in this situation of being sort of sandwiched between North and South, East and West, found itself in a precarious situation as a regional pivot between, on one hand, NATO and Russia, on the other hand. An example, let's say, is the discussion over the Montreux Convention that governs the regime of passage to and from the Black Sea. NATO's interest is to, for instance, strategically encircle Russia from the south, from its soft underbelly, which is the Black Sea, whereas Russia's interest is to keep NATO out of the Black Sea. Which is actually one of the reasons, from Moscow's perspective, why this war started, because, expansion of NATO to the east, further to accept membership, and the Ukraine into membership, they thought would be the sort of the last straw. That's the sort of perception from the Russian side. So in this, kind of security dilemma, NATO, for instance, suggested Turkey to lead a standing naval task force in the Black Sea to demonstrate its leadership as a form of confidence-building measure. However, Turkey resisted that temptation and gave it a cold shoulder till now. It has so far refused to abide by the request from Washington and Brussels to increase NATO presence in the Black Sea. And in my view, it's because simply, sailing through dire economic straits, it cannot afford another fallout with Russia in the middle of a crisis. So, and I'll come to that next in due course on what some of the reasons behind why it cannot abandon one party to the favor of the other. So it's balance, navigating a delicate balance between Kiev and NATO on one hand and Moscow on the other. Knowing that any strategic shift, let's say, to engage with Russia in this, the volatile confines of the Black Sea, a fait accompli, let's say, an exchange of fire, a hot incident, God forbid, could expose it to sort of tremendous pressure from both sides. What Turkey prefers to do as a middle power is to do business with both sides. And it is doing business with both sides. So, and there is a perception of neutrality in here. That's the downside, because some countries view Turkey's approach as lacking a strong enough stance against Russia's aggression. So it can be discussed, to the degree to which, one can take a stance against this aggression. It's not that black or white, so there are gray areas in between. And I think Turkey is playing in that gray area. And yes, it's as a NATO member, it's obligated to provide, some level of military support to Ukraine. And it has, it has supplied drones and other military equipment, most famous of which are the TB2 Bayraktar unmanned aerial vehicles or aerial drones, that have proven decisive to repel the attack on Kyiv in the initial weeks of the war. And now Ankara has announced its intention to build a factory in Ukraine to manufacture UAVs in Ukraine, which is another solid example of its commitment to defend Ukraine's territorial integrity. Now, coming to why Turkey is playing that balancing game instead of clearly picking a side with Ukraine. It's because Turkey's anxiety in this delicate relationship with Moscow stems from security concerns and trade dependence on Russia. It has limited leverage on Russia for these reasons. Turkish-Russian trade has grown despite tight scrutiny and sanctions by the West. And the volume of trade has more than doubled since the war and exceeded, $65 million in 2023, in large part due to cooperation in energy, tourism, and defense sectors in recent years. This is even though, so there is this, we see the compartmentalization of relations. So all this trade growth and economic partnership, development in economic relations, despite the fact that Ankara finds itself unsettled by much about Russia's foreign policy and in Syria and the Caucasus. So their interests clash in those other theaters, but nevertheless, they cooperate to a certain extent in economic relations. The Black Sea is a transport and power projection corridor through which 60% of Russian seaborne trade passes each year. And the Montreux Convention allows this. So Turkey did not and cannot close the straits to Russia under current circumstances to civilian ships. It has closed it to military ships, navies of both parties. But coming to the point about Turkey's dependence on Russia, it runs a large and a persistent trade deficit and remains, I would say, as the weaker party in this cooperative rivalry it forged with Russia during in the past 6 years. And a significant part of that is natural gas, i.e. energy, geopolitics. It holds strategic importance for Turkey's security outlook as a crucial commodity for consumption, industry production, and power generation. And with Russia being the main supplier of oil, gas, and coal, and more recently, nuclear energy to Turkey, it's building Turkey's first nuclear energy plant in the south on the coast of the Mediterranean. So that wields a significant bargaining power to Russia over Turkey. All in all, whether Turkey's delicate balancing act in this conflict had success is debatable. Yes, it has managed to maintain communication channels open, but it hasn't achieved a lasting ceasefire or fully addressed the core issues of the conflict, which is cessation of hostilities and withdrawal from territories under occupation and a permanent, peaceful settlement. But it has played its part, I think, to the extent that it can, because of the limitations and constraints it faces in its economic and security relationships. There's a certain, I think, a ceiling that it cannot go above. But the future of its balancing act, I think, depends on this evolving situation in Ukraine and very much to third parties who are also acting behind the scenes in this conflict. So let me end it here.
Thank you. Building on this, I think let's hear from Gustavo on Africa's multi-alignment position, because in the African case, or the case of a lot of African countries, stands in contrast with that of Turkey. Their refusal to systematically align themselves with efforts to condemn Russia have prompted accusations of them fence-sitting, of expediency. Gustavo, do you think that these accusations are warranted, or can the measured case-by-case approach taken by a majority of African states be attributed to other factors, foreign policy doctrines, or legitimate pursuit of their national interests, or other factors?
Thank you very much, Osama. And I think I wanted to start this answer with something that Sarat just mentioned now about the idea of a balancing act. And I think for African countries, that balancing process has certainly been a key highlight and part of the way in which different countries within the continent responded to the conflict, and particularly how they have adjusted and changed positions and approaches since February 2022. And I think often when we talk about this idea that of fence-sitting or of African countries often came from when we assess and we look into an apparent split of votes within the UN General Assembly of African votes, where we would almost half of the continent voted in favor of resolutions that were condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the other half largely abstained. I think Eritrea was perhaps the only country that voted against those resolutions. And if we only look into the voting patterns, we could potentially identify a split within the continent. I think in reality, the continent was far more united in its views than it may seem so. And I think there is a few reasons that may help us believe that this was the case. One of them is that when you look into the vote justification of African countries, whether they voted in favor of condemning the invasion or they abstained of those resolutions, they were very similar. You can look into the narratives that Kenya, for instance, provided in terms of the condemnation, but particularly focusing on the need and the importance of identifying peaceful means to resolve the conflicts, and particularly through mediation processes. If you look into South Africa's narratives, which has been one of the countries mostly under pressure in terms of its voting patterns, that has abstained in every resolution since February 22 regarding the conflict, it also talks about the importance of peaceful measures, of addressing the conflicts, the importance of mediation, and has repeatedly actually mentioned that the issue about sovereignty and about the threats that it provides to internationally recognized borders remains a big challenge. So there is something else within that I think make us that would force us to think about how has Africa responded to the conflict. I think the first point, and I think Len mentioned that earlier, is the fact that while for European countries and while for Western countries, this war is often seen within the lenses of an existential crisis, and it has an existential implication to their own regions, to their own geopolitical presence. For African countries, often this was seen that this is an European conflict, very far away, and we don't have the leverage or the capacity of influencing that. So it's better for us to distance ourselves from any kinds of this very divisive space, particularly we talk about a north-south divide, but also it's very much influenced and infused by the increasing competition between global superpowers. So to a certain degree, when African countries have, and if we're looking to trade, not the only way of looking into leverage or influence, but I think is a very useful way of thinking about that. African countries trade a lot with the West, with Europe, with the United States, with Japan, if we consider Japan as a part of an extended West, but they also increasingly trade with other global superpowers, whether it's China, whether it's India, whether it's Russia. So in that sense, they are calculations in terms of not just about alliance, and I think there has been a strong momentum for revitalizing the concept of non-alignment. I think it's often misconstrued, I think, including from the countries that are sometimes presenting the idea that they are non-aligned. But to a certain degree, geopolitically, they see themselves in the middle of a geopolitical battle that is intrinsically is not theirs. And I think that is an important component because it goes beyond the narrative that has often been presented. And I've seen and I've been part of discussions with colleagues in Europe and in North America, where there was often this idea that the West lost Africa within this process. And I think it's a very problematic statement. First, to lose something, you should have owned that first. And I think it shows a degree of those spheres of influence that we often attribute to the positions of Russia or China when they're developing their foreign policy. I think second, none of the global superpowers at this particular stage seems to have the capacity of entirely replacing the other side. Meaning that when you are within the global south, and particularly in Africa, where we often are some of the weakest part of the global bargain, making some of those choices become incredibly complicated. Of course, that doesn't mean that the war had no impact within the continent. And I think we saw particularly in 2022, in terms of the impact that it had on grain prices and wheat and fertilizers in particular. And Sarat mentioned earlier about the grain deal that was broke by Turkey and the United Nations, but largely supported by African countries. Because to a certain degree, when the war became particularly important for the continent, when created risks in terms of increased food insecurity in Africa because of inflation, cost of food, and the capability of countries to be able to continue purchasing food in the international market. Now, and we saw that when presidents of Senegal, Macky Sall, and Muhammad Faki from the African Union went to visit President Putin in Moscow, the main focus wasn't just about the idea of that the different parties should talk to one another, but how could countries like Russia reduce the likelihood that African countries would be damaged by this particular conflict, which is seen by many as a regional conflict, not as a global conflict, but a regional European conflict within the continent. At the same time, we saw increasing visibility of our foreign policies. We saw in 2022 and 2023 increasing number of global leaders coming to visit African countries, whether it is from Germany, from the US, from China, from Russia, and largely this feeling that is increasingly being created in the continent that there is a risk that we're going to have a new iteration of African being used as proxy in global conflicts. In 2022, as an example, the United States released a new policy to Africa. Antony Blinken came here to Pretoria in South Africa to launch it. And I think while it was wildly well received, and particularly in terms of some of the potential new approaches that the US was planning to take within the continent, there is one sentence that created a major degree of discomfort. When the United States said in their policy that one of the objectives of the African strategy for Africa is to counter the malign influence of Russia and China in the continent, that makes clear to policymakers and to the public opinion that we are not the focus. China and Russia are, and the continent became a terrain, a battlefield of that competition between global superpowers. So at the same time, it's not to say that the pressure that Western countries put into African countries had no impact. And I think the South African case is perhaps the most visible of them all. South Africa was widely criticized in 2022, not just for abstaining. I think that is where a lot of it started, but particularly by a seemingly confusing position in terms of how it would actually see the conflict, how it would see Russia, and internally created to a large degree, considering that we had different narratives being presented by the presidency, by the foreign ministry, and that created a degree of feeling that South Africa wasn't so predictable in terms of its own positions and its narratives as well. South Africa, to a certain degree, focus on the idea that it's a non-aligned country. I think that it brought back something that is quite important for the country since it joined the non-aligned movement in the 1990s. But there was a confusion with the concept itself, because to a large degree, when we talk about non-alignment, for many, even within here in South Africa, there is a feeling that we are talking about neutrality or an equidistance of feelings and behavior. But to a large degree, I think what we're starting to more and more see within South Africa, and I think to other countries in the continent as well, is that the idea of non-alignment has much more to do with the idea of having margin of maneuver and autonomy in developing foreign policy priorities. We had some internal issues, and when it came to a number of high-level visits from South Africa to Russia, we had military exercises with Russia and China that was on the same date of the first anniversary of the conflict, and particularly the big tension between the United States and South Africa when the US ambassador called a press conference to say that South Africa was providing arms to Russia via one vessel that had docked in Simonstown near Cape Town. All of that increased the pressure from the United States and from the West, and increased a lot of domestic pressure that South Africa would become more clear, not necessarily to identify, to change its narratives, but for many of us analysts or people that are following foreign policy in the country, there was a sense of that we were not quite understanding West South Africa, what they were doing and where they were coming from. That led to a big adjustments in terms of the policies within the country. And I'll just briefly conclude with that, and then so that we can go to the next question. First, there was a much more controlled narrative in terms of who is talking and who is negotiating South Africa's foreign policy when it comes to the conflict, focusing much more in terms of the foreign ministry rather than the ruling party. Second, to engage with other African countries in a manner to try to provide more helpful solutions to the conflict. And that largely was symbolized first by the visits that 6 heads of states from Africa did to Kyiv and St. Petersburg in June last year. And if we look into the position documents that was presented, often misconstrued as a peace plan, I think it has much more of an idea of a position paper from the 6 countries. It has a lot to do with not only with some of the principles of sovereignty that needs to be respected, but a lot of them that would be very much in line with ideas that Western countries were presenting, whether it was the importance of dealing with the issue of children, the issue of prisoners of wars, and so on. But since then, we've seen South Africa becoming almost deliberately serving as a bridge between the two sides. South Africa is the only African country that has been engaged in the Ukraine peace formula discussions since Copenhagen until now, is co-chairing a working group with the United Kingdom, dealing precisely with the issue of resolution of conflicts, and has almost alternated engagements with Ukrainians and Russian sides since to showcase better this idea of non-alignment. So let me conclude this answer for now, and then I hope we can continue with other points within this discussion.
Thank you, Gustavo. Very insightful answer, I think. And it gives us an idea about the factors that led to African countries choosing to position themselves the way they did, and especially in the case of the General Assembly vote. And you mentioned something very, very interesting about African countries wanting to have a margin of maneuver when dealing with the big powers. And I want to go back to Len and ask a question, because I think this joins something that Len recently wrote about southern countries, that despite their inherent diversity, the countries of the New South share a common agenda, a vision of multipolarity and diffusion of global power. Do you think that this prospect is realistic, or are predictions of a bipolar configuration of global power more likely? And why do you think it is possible to speak of a New South today?
Thank you so very much, Osama. And I've been sitting here very happily and listening to Gustavo and Sarat, because this is such an interesting conversation. And, you know, I just wish we had all afternoon, maybe, around some tea to continue this conversation. But a couple of things. Let me respond to what you've just put on the table now, but I would like to go back and just add maybe a little bit, one or two, to a couple of the things said by Gustavo and Sarat, if I may, but very, very quickly. Yes, I mean, one of the questions I get asked all of the time whenever I'm speaking about this idea of the New South, well, what do you mean? One, what's new in this New South? And two, is this a moment? Is this a movement? I mean, what are you even talking about? Because these countries are big and small, they're rich and poor. They're not even geographically of the South. And I'm not even going to get into that debate, because when we speak about the West, we acknowledge that Australia and New Zealand are part of the West, okay? So it's Japan. So we don't need to go into that sort of normative discussion. But I think it's really important to say that if you take a look at what Russia speaks to as its own foreign policy and global objective, or India or Brazil or South Africa or Indonesia, and other countries that are not middle powers but are from the South, they all speak to a certain core values or objectives that they're looking forward to. One, a diffusion of global power. Two, reform of multilateral institutions so that there is more parity, more equity, and more of a construct that puts development at the center. Support for countries not to be cap in hand asking for development assistance, but contracted fairly. For example, we have, you know, the idea of the fourth or fifth iteration of industrialization in the world, dealing with the green energy transition. Countries in Africa, for example, and Indonesia and Latin America, are not looking for extraction of their raw materials. Africa is arguably the world's best resourced continent, and yet it is the most underdeveloped. Countries want parity in negotiating partnerships which are genuine, that will allow them to move up the value chain. And there are a number of things like this, dealing with inclusion and equity and rules, as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of South Africa always puts it. We do want to live in a rules-based order, in a world guaranteed by rules, but not one in which the referee changes the rules when the referee no longer likes them. Okay, there are a number of things that we can speak to that all fall within this basket of things that all of these countries, whether they're big or small, are all looking for: inclusion, justice, parity. So that's one little piece. The issue of whether this is moving towards a bipolar construct or a multipolar one, and again, I will say it's moving very quickly towards both. It is a bipolar international structure in that indisputably there are two superpowers, the United States and there's China, and we can argue one is in decline and the other is still ascending. And we've seen this historically through time and through history. But underneath that level of that bipolar structure, we have these middle powers who have used precisely this period of polycrisis to see what I've been speaking to as a multi-layered multipolarity, right? They have moved outside of their normal range of influence and acted outside of that normal range, including with their own foreign policy. What that has done is to provide a larger menu of choice for countries of the global south. It is that increase in prosperity on the part of the middle powers and their agency that has given momentum to what we are now calling the New South. I mean, if you go to even Latin America and the Caribbean, the tiny country of Guyana, which recently has become one of the world's fastest growing economies because of all of the wealth of oil that has been discovered right next door to Venezuela, has become a very, very, very important magnet for interest by the United States. Secretary of State Blinken has visited many, many, many times. The United States has sent all kinds of advisors, is signing all sorts of MOUs with this small country because of a vital resource. And last year, July, when Secretary of State Blinken was there, within 10 days of his visit, the president of Guyana flew up to Beijing and said to China, you know, so we are going to be doing a lot of business together and let's execute all of these things. I need investments from you. I need all of these sort of things and a good partnership. And where do we sign? So even small countries are using this period of newfound agency to say something which is very, very important. And I think Gustavo alluded to it. You know, that one sentence, Gustavo, which you mentioned, created that sense of unease on the part of many African countries, is one that comes to mind, because it is true that one of the things I think the Western world is missing right now is the fact that the great powers do not own the sovereignty of other states. And when President Biden recently announced a new partnership with parts of Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean, he said, you know, it is because we're offering options between evil and good. It's not how the rest of the world sees it. Countries exercise their sovereignty in the execution of partnerships that best serve their interests. And for the countries of the global south, particularly, well, all of them, right? Except maybe perhaps China as a superpower, all of them, or maybe even also China, all of them see threats in a very different way. Whereas for the West, we can agree that those threats are seen through military lens, you know, and geopolitical lens to a certain degree. The threats for developing countries and countries of the New South and the South are internal threats, the inability to support the development of their people and their ambition. That is the internal threat that they need to ensure is always kept at bay. And that's why they will sit at any table that provides the security of financing, joint ventures, whatever it is, that moves the needle with respect of jobs, investments, certainty with respect of the future. So it's a very different set of interests that we have at play, which is why, Gustavo, when you say that countries need that space to exercise the development choices that they need, it's about survival. It's about the perception of the future. And I think the West needs to understand that working with one group of countries should no way be de facto associated with working against any other countries. And that's not the way in which the New South is seeking to expand its agency. It's seeking to work with everybody and seeking not to be at war with anyone. And I think that's one of the narratives that we need to be able to put to rest. And it's just a second, a couple of quick things. The issue of sanctions, the weaponization of policies, whether they're trade or other policies, right? In a sense, it's all of these rounds of sanctions on Russia that also were that tipping point in galvanizing or accelerating the rate of solidarity among countries of the global South, because they all imagined that one day they too might do something that puts them in the situation of a Russia, right? With all of the possibilities of sanctions against them. And they are now creating buffers for themselves, right? In creating alternatives to SWIFT. The BRICS have just taken a decision to be able to do their trade in local currency. They have set up their own currency reserves so that if ever there is pressure on the currency of any of their countries, they can go up and short in pretty much the same way that Saudi Arabia and was it UAE? Some of the Gulf states were able to provide deposits into the Central Bank of Turkey just before the last presidential elections. And that dealt in a very strong way against the precipitation of a slide in the value of the lira. So these countries are putting in place very, very practical means of being able to take care of their own security, economic and developmental security, and their interests. So when people ask me, well, is this a moment or a movement? I think time will tell. But I think one of the important things for us to perhaps agree on is that some of these things that are being put in place today are not going to go away in terms of the new institutional architecture, the new institutions that are being built by whether the BRICS or SCO, for example, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and all of these alliances that are now quite alive, that these new trade routes which are being built, for example, to bypass the Suez Canal and work directly with African countries, those new initiatives are not going to go away. And those countries are investing in each other and using their capital also to ensure the prosperity of others within their wider alliance. So a moment or a movement, time will tell, but I really do think that we have some markers on the ground that are important ones and are not going to go away. And the landscape that we've been speaking about geopolitically is going to continue to change.
Thank you, Len. I want to build on something you said about the newfound agency and the friction it caused on the issue of sanctions. To ask Serhat maybe about his opinion on why many countries in the South, including the economic heavyweights, Brazil, Turkey, UAE, etc., which have not adhered to the sanction regimes adopted by G7 members against Russia, and some of these countries even voicing their opposition, strong opposition to these restrictions. Could the tensions, Serhat, in your opinion, around this specific issue become an increasing source of tension between the North and the South as the EU, the UK, the US are moving to sanction companies in third countries that do not apply these imposed sanctions? And where does Turkey stand on this specific issue, especially given the strong economic relations it has developed with Russia and the possibility that Turkish businesses and financial firms may be targeted for non-compliance?
Before I come to the crux of your question, let me add a few comments that are in also relation to Len's and Gustavo's remarks. So I think Glenn was spot on there. I think the best phrase that describes the current situation is this multi-layered, multipolar order. If we look at it from an economic perspective, the world is increasingly divided along competing economic blocks. I say competing because really the aims, objectives, and the sort of power structures in these different groups make them necessarily, competitive against each other. And one is, for instance, the industrialized West, which is at the helm of the rule-based liberal world order, in G7. On the other hand, you have the emerging players in the South, such as India, Brazil, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Russia, that claim more agency, and you can, of course, group them under G20. And then the least developed, disadvantaged nations of Africa and Latin America, Asia also perhaps, that gather around China in G77. So this world order is a bit different because it's first more transactional, where nimble middle powers play great powers off of one another and pursue, their economic interests in a shifting stage of partnerships. But it's different from the days of, for instance, the bipolar days of the Cold War era, and that's why I think it's more likely to be a multipolar than a bipolar world order. Because in a bipolar world, you're either on one camp or the other. You cannot be in both. Countries, smaller powers are grouped around superpowers, and that's it. You're locked into it, and you have to stay. Changing course is pretty much not allowed. But in this order, there is more fluidity between these blocks, and the transition from one to the other is more plausible than the rigid bounded order days of, let's say, the Cold War era. One can be a member of multiple blocks. You can be in G20 and you can be in G7, yeah. But you cannot be dominant in all groups under the current power structure. For instance, the US overshadows by far, overshadows the G7. The middle powers have more sway and agency over the G20, and China leads G77. Okay, so in this world order, there is more fluidity and less commitment to this kind of alliance building and commitment to strategic partnerships. It's shorter lived, and I would say, as Len also pointed out, is dependent on geopolitical developments, because more is the case nowadays, especially after the Russia-Ukraine war, is that geopolitics trumps economic considerations. Countries are first and foremost concerned about their security in the first place. So all these economic arrangements are more fluid. Alliances are more fluid than they used to be in the past. And the second thing I'd like to mention is what Gustavo alluded to, which is that middle powers are a terrain for competition between superpowers, and they're not happy with it. And this is one of the reasons why they try to evade these sanctions and find their own ways of doing business outside the confines of the rules-based liberal order set by the Western institutions or defined by them in days of the Bretton Woods era or the Second World War, rearrangement of global power structures. And when we look at the global divide on sanctions, there are various reasons why countries like Turkey, Indonesia, Brazil, and others have not joined. And these include, first, like in my previous remarks, I mentioned reliance on Russian trade and energy. I would say that's Turkey's case, but also food and livelihoods. So in Africa's case, that's also important. And in the Middle East, because remember that Lebanon and Egypt heavily depended on Russia for their grain imports before. Second is a desire to maintain neutrality or good relations with both sides. You see that with Saudi Arabia and with Turkey and the UAE, or historical skepticism of Western-led sanctions in Egypt against Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and others. Yes, there is a potential for tension, coming to your question on, whether these Western sanctions and the quest for agency on the part of middle powers to evade them, how that plays out, whether it's prone to create tensions. It already does. Yes, that's likely to grow. the US and EU threatening sanctions on companies in non-compliant countries creates friction, which include, disruption to trade and investment flows, and that's, that hurts both sides. But on the recipient party, it's likely to be seen as an infringement on national sovereignty. There is no UN decision at the moment on Ukraine-Russia war on placing sanctions on X or Y country. If there is a UN Security Council resolution, if there is an agreement and a set sanctions regime by the UN, then everybody who's a member of, in every country who's a member of the UN must comply with it. But this is not the case currently. It's a political decision. And to impose this on other countries looks like an infringement on their national sovereignty. Now, coming to Turkey's position, I think one of the questions, and this is not solely on Turkey, it's in several other countries in the region, is this export of military-linked dual-purpose equipment to Russia. Yes, it has soared in 2023, has grown by 6 times in comparison to pre-war figures, which include items like communication equipment, microchips, and even white goods. You may have read or heard from news in those days that such critical rare components are taken out from other appliances and plugged into military equipment, allegedly used in like cruise missiles, drones, and even helicopters. So these are prone to continue to create friction. And we do observe a certain level of compliance, such as the ban on Russian payment system, the MIR, in Turkey, and how major banks in the UAE, for instance, began to impose restrictions on Russian clients due to the risk of secondary sanctions, like they stopped accepting money or transfers from Russian customers unless they have some kind of local business. Yes, it's possible to open an account in the UAE, but not as straightforward, as easy as it used to be. So I think countries as such are walking a tightrope, avoiding direct sanctions violations, but not offering significant support to Russia's effort either, unlike what's been claimed. Yes, but I mean, Russia is an industrial, military industry power itself. So it's, I think 20% of its GDP last year was on the military industry complex. So it doesn't really depend on other countries, because it's got rich rare earths, commodities and other resources and human capital to be able to do it itself. It may sort of augment the flow of these critical parts or components from other countries, but not to the extent that I think has been sort of alluded to in Western press. Possible outcomes, yes, I think the US, EU countries in general who impose these sanctions might continue what they do now, i.e. target specific companies or financial institutions seen as aiding Russia's war effort. And, these countries will try to negotiate to find ways to comply without crippling their own economy. Yes, it's a potential source of tension, but the outcome depends on the severity of, economic ties with Russia. Turkey's case is quite strong, as I explained earlier, but in some cases it's not that strong. So the level of pressure, I think, will depend on their level of engagement with Russia.
Thank you. Back to you, Gustavo. You earlier mentioned the increase in awareness by African countries that they have a margin of maneuver in dealing with countries in the north, and also in dealing with the parties of this conflict. And Russia and Ukraine, we have noticed that they have deployed a lot of efforts to reinforce their engagement with African countries, both on the political and economic fronts, with visits from their respective foreign ministers, initiatives on food security, as well as President Zelensky's address to the African Union, and St. Petersburg hosting the second Russia-Africa summit. Do you think that the Ukrainian approach has borne some fruits, or does the Russian head start since Russia has begun its strategy of engagement in the early 2010s, if I'm not mistaken, complicate the effort? And also, second question, do you see strategic adjustments on part of the Russians in their engagement with African countries as a response to the development in the developments in the conflict?
Thanks so much. And I just wanted to briefly just add some thoughts into what Len and Sarat mentioned now. And I think Len mentioned I think this question around, is this the change of the global order a moment or a movement? And I think that is an important question for us to ask, particularly because there is also another element to that question. Are global South countries trying to change the global order, or has the global order changed and global South countries are adjusting to it? And for me, it seems to me a bit more of the second rather than the first, because to a certain degree, when we look into the capability and or willingness of the global superpowers to serve this role that the United States played in the last couple of decades as the security guarantor of the global order diminishing, their own calculations and thoughts also change. And I think Saudi Arabia is a great example. When Saudi Arabia started perceiving that the United States was, quote unquote, an unreliable partner for not necessarily providing some of the informal security guarantees that it had provided, particularly in relation to Iran, that's when we start seeing countries like Saudi Arabia not only selling much more goods and oil, and of course has a lot to do with the fact that the US became energy self-sufficient in the last decades, but to a certain degree, China and India play now quite a different role for a country like Saudi Arabia. And I think that pivot to Asia that the US has been trying to do for some time does provide different spaces for other global powers in terms of how they will engage with the global South. But I think the very sanctions to Russia, to a certain degree, brings new risks to the global order. And I think that what Len mentioned and what Sarat mentioned is when countries start perceiving the US dollar not as a public good, but as a risky asset, they change their plans and calculations on a daily basis. So the idea of starting to trade with local currencies, Len mentioned the issue within BRICS about increasing potentially the trading local currencies. There is a decision to be made in October in the BRICS summit in Russia regarding the potential creation of a new systems of payments that not displace the US dollar as the main currency, but it creates alternatives. It's a risk management. We can call it hedging, but I think it's mostly as a risk management for these countries. Now, back to your question, and I think when it comes to the role that both Russia and Ukraine have played in the continent in the last couple of years, I think certainly the Russians had a head start for several reasons. Their diplomatic presence in the continent is much larger than Russia's. And to a certain degree, I think the Russians, what they were capable of doing is to enhance certain narratives that I think often they start correctly, and they often exploit and at times go along with ideas on how African countries perceive their role within the global order, and particularly a role of marginalization. That narrative is incredibly powerful because when the Russians when they're engaging with countries and they're saying that the way in which the West deals with Africa is problematic, there is no dispute within the continent about that. I think you can dispute whether the Russians can provide an alternative to that. If we're looking in terms of the size of the economy, in terms of how much they trade, in terms of how much they engage at different layers within African societies, that can be questioned. But I think the first part of the narrative is a part of the narrative that largely gets acceptance in many courts within the continent. The second issue, I think that the Russians have been able to maintain a degree of influence within the continent is the statement and the reminders of the support that the Soviet Union provided to any liberation movements within the continent throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and up to the 1980s. And yes, we can question and to say that often it was Ukrainians engaging in that support, and I think to a large degree, both sides engaged with liberation movements in the continent, but I think the Russians have been far more proactive and capable of exploiting and expanding this narrative that takes quite an important role within a lot of the ruling parties, within a lot of the elites, and this idea that while we were fighting the West, the Soviet Union was supporting us. I think that the biggest challenge, and maybe shifting to Ukraine to a certain degree, I think the biggest challenge the Ukrainians have faced, I think they started with a very difficult narrative to accept for many African stakeholders. There was a narrative that this was an European, this was about our European identity. This was about freedom and democracy, where a lot of these narratives have been presented to African countries in the last couple of decades, and often with disastrous consequences, whether it is the approval of the no-flight zone into Libya, and I think that in particular presents a lot of those challenges, but also I think with the heavy hand that a lot of Western countries and how they pressured African leaders to side with Europe in that sense, created a sense of why is this suddenly the most important conflict in the world, where we've been for a long time asking for support in terms of the conflicts that we have. Just a quick example on how the issue of narratives and how important that is, and how that actually created difficulties for Ukraine within the continent. Often South Africa has been criticized in the last couple of years for what is called a whataboutism. That every time that someone was mentioning to South Africa something about Ukraine, South Africa would often say, "What about that?" A couple of weeks ago, I went to look into a lot of the speeches and presentations from our foreign ministers to try to remember what exactly those "what about this" or that were. They always were about Palestine. Palestine is always there. It's an incredibly important foreign policy issue for South Africa, perhaps the most consistent non-African file within African foreign policy within the last 30 years. And maybe bringing what Len briefly mentioned earlier, there is a connection between the conflict in Gaza and the conflict in Ukraine, because South Africa, to a certain degree, felt somehow that its whataboutism was vindicated with what has been happening in the last couple of months. This idea of double standards, that we suddenly need to drop all of the relations that we have around the world to support European positions in the war in Ukraine. But when alleged or South African perceived genocide in Gaza, the response was much more mute and much more controlled from the West. So that, in a way, provides a challenge, I think, in terms of the Ukrainian narrative within the continent. I think what we have seen from the Ukrainian side, and perhaps a more pragmatic approach, is an approach that does not create an exceptionalism of the case of Ukraine, but rather one that has similarities with other conflicts within the continent. That, I think, may enable the Ukrainians to gain more sympathies, to gain a better space for conversation within the continent. I think particularly the issue of children has gaining a lot of momentum, especially when we compare issues around children protection, both in Gaza and Ukraine and in places like DRC and Sudan. I think that has been perhaps seen by a lot of the African leaders in the African Peace Initiative that started in June last year. That is seen as, to a certain degree, a point of commonality of positions. And it's not just an issue for African countries to criticize the role of Russia. And I think we've seen most countries to a large degree saying that the issue about the protection of internationally defined borders is crucial and to a certain degree, but how do we respond to that is quite different. So to a certain degree, we should expect Russians to increase their presence within the continent, particularly because they're so isolated right now that they are looking for new opportunities for investments and for engagements in different parts of the world. And I think I was in the Russia-Africa Summit last year in St. Petersburg, and perhaps the most interesting thing for me wasn't the usual discussions between Africa and Russia about issues related to defense or issues related to energy or issues related to certain education or software issues, was the issues that are usually not part of the discussions between African countries and Russia. It's about railways, it's about insurance, it's about banking, it's about what Len mentioned earlier about new routes of trade around, which of course particularly important for Russia as they're looking to diversify their engagements globally. But it doesn't mean that it's not important for African countries either. The issue about investments and so on. And that perhaps can bring, I like what Sarat said about this multi-layered multipolarity as being often very transactional, because it is transactional in the sense of when African countries believe that the double standards means that those values are not equal for everyone. Thus, we would be looking in terms of engagements where it benefits us as a continent. Now, will Ukraine be able to provide some of the same types of vehicles and support that Russians do? Probably not. But I think the expansion of embassies from Ukraine within the continent, a less tone-deaf narrative with African stakeholders that it seems to be taking shape at the moment will help, and perhaps presents a continent that is not necessarily taking one side or the other, but is able to listen to both sides. And I think this is perhaps where I think African countries can really provide an element of support to this conflict. And I think especially as there is an increasing pressure for dialogue and negotiation to happen. We've seen discussions around a potential Ukraine peace conference that up to very recently, Western countries were very open to say that there is no way the Russians would participate. Now we're starting to see countries like China and Switzerland already engaging with the Russians to potentially see whether they would participate and who would be the most likely mediators in that process. It most likely won't be European countries. We will be looking into perhaps Middle Eastern countries, African countries, Latin American countries, because these are some of the few countries that have open channels of dialogues with both sides. So in that sense, I think there is an opportunity not only to see this sitting on defense or engaging with both sides as transactional, but I think there is an enormous potential of countries within the global south and perhaps some African countries to play a much stronger role when parties start talking to one another in terms of identifying ways of resolving the conflict in Ukraine at the moment.
Thank you, Gustavo. I think we're starting to run out of time. Maybe two last questions, and I'll ask you to be very brief in your answers. The first one is to Gustavo, and I want to stay with you. You mentioned Sudan, and recently there have been reports of Ukrainian special forces operating in support of the Sudanian army against Wagner elements aligned with the Rapid Support Forces. How can we explain this transposition of the Russia-Ukraine conflict in the Sudanese context?
I think it's a very risky development for not only for Sudan, but I think for the continent, because that spillover effects of the conflict in Ukraine and the potential idea of Sudan being utilized as a proxy, which has been the case, I think, in terms of a lot of the global powers, whether they're in the Middle East, whether they're in Europe, whether they are in North America. I think the the expansion of that conflict into African territory is particularly worrying, because once again, it brings some of the conversations that we had earlier around agency and what is the position of the conflicts of the continents within the global order. Are we part of a battle between the big superpowers and we're going to be used as proxy within that process? If that is the case, I think that creates major risks for us as a continent, and I think it creates particular risks for a country like Sudan that has been facing one of the most destructive conflicts worldwide at the moment. So I think it is important within our own engagements as a continent in global fora, but particularly when it comes to specifically to Ukraine and Russia, to showcase that this has potential intended or non-intended consequences that would go way beyond the conflict in Ukraine, and perhaps not only exporting or expanding or creating a spillover of a specific regional conflict in Europe, but creating new dimensions that I think has a much larger risk for the region and for global politics as a whole.
Thank you. And maybe my last question, and maybe if Len and Serhat want to answer it, or one of them, is about how can countries of the South contribute positively to the resolution, or at least to the de-escalation of the conflict.
Serhat, why don't you go first, and I'll just maybe tack a sentence onto the end.
Thank you, Len. Just a couple of sentences, I will go further than that, since we are also, I think, a bit over time. I think number one is to keep channels of communication open. So this is not the time or the place to pick sides and to shut doors to the other in respect of, certain geopolitical transient interests. I would say it's time to sort of have a collective look on the good or the improvement of the global economic situation, and how to dissipates into countries of the global South. And I think we very much have seen this already. It's just that we need to continue this path forward rather than be tempted to, or being pulled into picking one side or the other. Because there are efforts clearly to do that on both camps, and it's quite natural because those are the parties with the greatest interest or the stake in the game. But we, as countries of the global South, should remain calm, cool-headed, and be open to mediate via keeping communication channels open to both sides. That's what I would say.
Okay, then over to me just very quickly. Two quick things I would say. One is that I feel exactly the same way as described by Gustavo with respect of the new developments in Sudan. We all saw what has happened with Libya, for example, when Libya has also become a staging ground for proxy wars of all different kinds. And the decimation of that country is something that we would not wish anywhere. Last quick point I would make is that perhaps, maybe the G20 might hold some agency, to use the word again, in this particular time. We see very much the agenda being pushed by President Lula, which is focusing not on war, bringing economic stability and peace, governance reform, energy and global governance reforms, multilateral reforms, and energy and food security. And all the conversations from the very beginning with all the ministers of the different ministerial meetings that have been taking place, even though when we read the Western press, the first things we see are all the comments being made of ministerial interventions with respect of Russia having invaded Ukraine. And we get a sense that the agenda has not been advanced. But when you read the official communique from the presidency of the G20, they very, very much are staying the line with respect of the agenda of the G20, which is to end the war and bring the world back to conditions of stability so that economic growth can once again take place. So I see that as a positive move, and I see it even more positive given the fact that after the presidency of Brazil, of course, we have South Africa coming into that seat, and they have been playing quite an important role from the very beginning, or at least very much trying to. So let's see. My 2 cents are, let's give the G20 a shot. Let's see what happens.
Thank you, Len. On this optimistic note, we conclude today's discussion. I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to our speakers for sharing their valuable insights today. I invite all viewers to explore our website for further insights, publications, and multimedia content on this subject. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Osama. Thank you, colleagues and friends.
Thank you very much. It was a great discussion.